Hello again, everyone. Hope you're well. This week on the opening bell, plenty again to get our teeth into as we reflect on bills in the States and indeed, of course, also out in Saudi. Plus, this week in history, we're going to delve into another couple of heavyweights from the 90s that we've talked about over the course of the last sort of month or so, and that is Evander Holyfield and Smokin Bert Cooper. What a time to follow heavyweight boxing. One of Matt's favourites, Smokin Bert, stirring Holyfield in one of those early rounds in a compelling, all-action, hard-hitting fight from 91. That's coming up this week in history. We'll talk about Katie and Serrano, the rematch. Of course, we are duty-bound to talk about what went down or what didn't go down with Jake Paul and Mike Tyson and everything else surrounding it. Matt Christie, how are you?
Good, mate. Can we just forget about everything else? Can we just talk about Smokin Bert Cooper, please? Let's just get to that.
How many times was Smokin Bert one punch from the promised land?
Oh, yeah, but with Smokin Bert, I think he would have had the intelligence that if you had presented him with a time machine, that he wouldn't go back to the start of round 3 against Evander Holyfield or back to the start of the first round against Michael Moorer. He'd have to go much, much further back to have had any chance to have kind of been the legend that many of us wanted him to be. But what a story. Yeah, looking forward to chatting about it.
Yeah, what a story. That's coming up later on this week in history. A couple of fights that are going to be coming up later on this month and indeed into next year. Callum Smith's been added to the Sonny Edwards Galal Yafai bill on November 30th. That's coming up the weekend after this. So Callum Smith back in action.
Yeah, good to see him back. I mean, he's had the quite sobering loss, didn't he, to Beterbiev. Which, you wonder if he is now asking himself some questions. That was the best fighter in the world in his weight class. And sometimes it's difficult to come back from that, particularly when you have ambitions of being the best fighter in your own weight class yourself, and you find that you're just so far behind the best. But yeah, I'll be interested to see what he looks like when he comes back and what kind of opponent it is as well. I doubt it will be a massively challenging one at this stage.
Yeah, fighters rationalise with themselves or they lie to themselves one way or another about defeats. Oh, I wasn't quite at my best, I was injured. Or sometimes they should just rationally say, listen, that guy is one of the best there's been over the last few decades, certainly one of the best that's around. You take him and Biv all out, I can beat everybody else or I'll be competitive with everybody else. And, Beterbiev's knocking on for 40 and, maybe if I stick around for another year or so, they're going to be gone.
There will be opportunities presenting themselves, one would think. I suppose the concern that I would have is that Callum Smith has always found it difficult to get those opportunities. But with another loss on his record, people thinking that he's closer to the end than the start, people might be willing to take a risk by fighting him.
And of course, Canelo, the other defeat on his record, and Canelo against David Benavidez has been kind of mooted and talked about. But Benavidez against Morrell has been confirmed on one of those PBC bills. That's going to be in the early part of next year. It's February 1st, I think it is, at the T-Mobile. Also on that bill, several other fights, including Figueroa against Fulton 2, a rematch there. So that's one bill to start thinking about for early next year.
I love the Benavidez-Morrell fight. Two guys that were chasing a showdown with Canelo. They can't get that, so fight each other. I like it.
Plan B. Well, Holyfield, of course, was supposed to be fighting Mike Tyson, wasn't he? In the early middle part of 1991. And Tyson got injured. That fight was off. Holyfield kind of bound time. And then Smokin Bert Cooper was jettisoned in at sort of 4 or 5 weeks' notice, wasn't he? So, yeah, the plan Bs can sometimes turn out to be quite interesting.
Well, it was Francesco Damiani who came in initially. So it was supposed to be November the 8th for Holyfield versus Tyson. Tyson pulled out injured. Then it was Francesco Damiani who came in. It was actually Smokin Bert actually came in about 4 or 5 days before the fight. So
Sorry,
imagine that.
he fought 4 weeks before, didn't he? Bert
Yes,
Cooper?
yes. He'd fought in October. Yeah. But nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw that one coming.
No, not at all. Larry Merchant explains all of that in his build up to the fight on the excellent HBO coverage. So that's coming up a bit later on. Right, we really should talk about either Taylor Serrano first or CBS against Gilberto Ramirez. And I think we go Taylor Serrano. Terrific fight. Again, no surprise. I think they're just made for each other, aren't they? Taylor and Serrano in just about every way. And it was such a competitive, hard-fought, bloody affair once again. Serrano cut again with the heads clashing again as they had done first time around. Maybe didn't quite hit the mountainous peaks of the first fight 2 years ago at Madison Square Garden, but in spells it wasn't far off. Certainly was fair enough, one way or another. Matt, did we get the right winner? Too difficult to judge? What did you think?
I thought that Serrano had just about edged it, but the majority of the rounds were so hectic and closely fought. It was one of those where I didn't think it was a robbery, but I thought Serrano was really unfortunate in several ways. I think with the cut that she endured, which was horrific. I thought at one point they're going to stop it. I think it was when it was looked at the second time. I thought they're just going to stop this. It was gaping, and I thought the cut person in the corner was it who was doing her cuts, but he did a tremendous job. Just stemming that flow, although the wound stayed open, the blood wasn't gushing. But I thought it could have been stopped at any point because it was a nasty wound, and the fact that Serrano managed to battle through that, I thought was credit to her. Credit also to Katie Taylor, because there was a point in the fight where I thought it was getting away from her. But I can certainly understand those that thought she was fortunate to get that. What about you?
I had Serrano just by a point. Well, it probably depends how you score round 8, where Taylor was given a warning early on. She'd been given a few warnings prior to that anyway, mainly for holding, wasn't it? And then there was a warning at the start of the 8th, and then it was right almost on the bell at the end of that 8th round. I had given that round to Serrano anyway, so I had that a 10-8 round effectively a 10-8 round to Serrano. I know the Netflix pundit who was scoring the fight had given that round to Taylor, so scored that round 9-9 with a point off. So that probably is the nub of the fight in some ways, but I always put brackets or stars next to the rounds that I think are really competitive, even while I'm scoring it. And 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were all rounds with brackets around them. And I think also because you've got, as you say, I think frenzied is the right, that's a really good word to apply to some of the exchanges of this. And when you've got those frenzied exchanges with differences in stylistic approach, Serrano coming forward, no doubt Serrano landing the heavier shots, particularly the left hand early on. But in those, I think the exchanges from sort of 5 onwards were getting harder to read and harder to score. Really trying to punch a fight like that in those exchanges is absolutely nonsensical to me and almost impossible unless you have some kind of computer program that is beyond our ken. I just don't think you can do it. And I think watching it live, it's hard enough. Watching it back on replay, it's hard enough to score those exchanges, Matt, wasn't it? And I thought it would be easier to score for Serrano in a lot of those exchanges stylistically, but Taylor was landing more than she had done earlier on in the fight in some of those exchanges later on in the fight in the second half. And I thought she just picked up her speed and she probably did better work in those later exchanges than maybe a lot of people would score for her, I think. So it was quite hard, but I just leaned towards Serrano, as I did first time around, but I probably feel they'd be more aggrieved this time than last.
Yeah, I think so. I think that they thought they'd got it. They thought they were ahead through most of the fight. The commentary was, I just found it excruciating, to be honest. I mean, I watched it as live. So I had kind of this idea on Friday night that maybe I should get up in the middle of the night to watch Mike Tyson, like I did in 1986 when he beat Trevor Berbick, and I thought maybe I just need to be watching this live, the end of the story, like I watched the start. I didn't wake up. I didn't set my alarm. I just thought, if I wake up, I will watch it. But I managed to stay off my phone, so I didn't know the result of the. I only ended up watching the two fights, Taylor Serrano and then Mike Tyson afterwards. But goodness me, I just found the commentary really hard to take, to the point that it was interfering with my enjoyment of a high quality, high action fight. I'm not sure the thinking behind that commentary, but what did you think? It's your trade, it's your bread and butter. What was your thinking of the commentary?
Yeah, I understand, looking at it objectively and neutrally, I understand why they picked that kind of setup. Moro's quite he's quite excitable and throws in some unusual lines that might resonate with layers of audiences who might be, familiar with wrestling and other American sports and computer games, and he will throw in those kind of lines. So I understand that pick. That makes sense. Rosie Perez to lend it a little bit of sort of Hollywood gold dust, I suppose, and then you've got Roy Jones Jr. sort of to lend some boxing balance and maybe an element of boxing royalty. So I get from the outset why they picked those, but it was. You felt bombarded a bit, I think, as a listener, and it was machine gun commentary and a little bombastic, and it was quite difficult. It was quite difficult.
I did have a problem with Roy Jones, and I was almost grateful for Roy Jones in the inverted commas main event for just being completely honest about what he could see. But yes, I think as well is that you mentioned the punch stats, that there was an awful lot of credence being given to those punch stats as if they were the gospel, if they're true. Serrano is almost doubling the output of Katie Taylor, and there were a few rounds I thought, well, they don't quite look like what I've just seen. I think if you are going to reference the punch stats, I think you have to be honest about their potential for being unrealistic, for not being accurate. And I think if you're going to mention them, you have to say that. You have to include that caveat. So I could understand again why perhaps some uneducated people would watch that fight and walk away from it thinking, how on earth did Amanda Serrano not win that fight? Because they're being bombarded by these punch stats and all manner of information from the commentary team. But it was a really good fight, and I think we said something last week, didn't we, that this fight was on the card. And yes, of course, it is because of Serrano's link up with Jake Paul. Credit to Jake Paul for that. But also, I think it was to add some kind of legitimacy to the bill, to add a real fight to the bill, because they would undoubtedly have been aware that the main event might have turned out in the way that it did. Surely they did. So I think that I was glad that some people who tuned in, and an awful lot of people watched, if we're to believe the figures that have been published. 50 million apparently for Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano, and 60 million, and this is households as opposed to people, households, for Jake Paul, Mike Tyson. Out of those 50 million that watched this Taylor Serrano fight, I would say an awful lot would have been entertained by it.
Absolutely. And those figures, if true, give you a sense of the appetite that might have been whetted with the Netflix executives, wherever they may be. Matt, how many of those were new subscribers? I suspect we'll get some information in the coming weeks regarding that. Perhaps we won't. But how this is viewed, how we view it as a success is going to be different to how they view it. But surely those numbers will whet the appetite for future events, however they may look.
One would hope so. The difficulty from Netflix point of view is how do you replicate an event like that? Now, you knew that Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul was a load of nonsense. I knew it. I would say the vast majority of hardcore fans knew full well that it was just a almost cynical cash grab. But ultimately, everybody was aware that fight was happening. And from Netflix's point of view, they didn't really have to dress it up. You had arguably the most famous living athlete in one corner, one of the most famous people that the world has ever seen in one corner, and then you had this social media phenomenon in the other. So they didn't have to go and tell the story of these fighters. They didn't have to spend time on educating the audience on what's going on here. It was very much there for them. Mike Tyson, Jake Paul, and that was a huge part of the appeal for Netflix. It was guaranteed to be big. But the thing is, over the weekend, both before the fight and after the fight, I took calls from Sky News, from BBC, from 2 or 3 different radio stations, and I did several interviews over the course of the weekend. Largely, they were aghast with a 58-year-old convicted rapist being involved in a fight of this size. Now, during one of the interviews, it was one of the ones after the fight, and they were saying, is this harmful for boxing? I did make the point, and I said something along the lines of, look, why did you not give me a ring a few weeks ago when there was a really good fight on? You're just kind of focusing on this, and this is the problem, I think, is that the last time I was bombarded with interview requests like that, I think, was around the time of Conor Benn, when Conor Benn's fight with Chris Eubank looked like it might still go ahead, despite the fact that he'd failed 2 tests. And there is this, it makes itself an easy target, I think, at times, boxing. I wasn't going to attempt to justify, and I think this is what people thought I was going to be doing, I'd be attempting to justify Tyson versus Jake Paul as a spectacle. I wasn't. I thought it was disgusting that it was commissioned as a professional fight. But you will get the media, and they will jump on a story like this, and not in a good way either. But you have to be honest. So many people were aware. My mom was aware. There's people down the gym that were aware. As soon as you say to anybody, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" You write about boxing. Oh, what's going to happen with Jake Paul and Mike Tyson then? It did its job, but I still find it abhorrent that it was commissioned as a professional fight, that it goes down on their records as a professional fight. 58-year-old man who lost his footing on the way to the ring. Did you see that when he first emerged and he lost his footing?
Yeah.
And he had to look down, shuffling around the ring in each of the 8 rounds, looking actually older than 58 in truth. And I thought as a spectacle, it was so unedifying. And I don't recall seeing a fight quite as unedifying as that. This wasn't Larry Holmes versus Mike Tyson. This wasn't Larry Holmes versus Muhammad Ali. This was a old man being hauled out of retirement. Not hauled. No, he knew what he was doing. But you get the point. It's horrible. My opinion on it. I found it really, really difficult to watch. And at the time, as I was watching, even though it was about 9 o'clock on the Saturday morning and it had already occurred, I didn't know what was going to happen. And in a way, and I think it was always going to be the case, either Jake Paul would walk through him or Jake Paul would show a bit of empathy, a bit of respect, and kind of carry him. And I was kind of grateful that he did in the end, because can you imagine if you'd have seen Mike Tyson out cold or getting horribly beaten up as a 58-year-old man or getting seriously hurt? So for that, I was grateful, but we don't need to do anything like that ever again.
Well, no. But then what did you expect? It was no more than I expected. What did the 50, 60 million people tuning in expect? What did they think they were going to see? Glimpses? A sudden rebirth of Tyson? Even he went back to the Tyson of 20 years ago when he was sitting on his backside against Danny Williams. The next year, sitting on his stool against Kevin McBride, sitting it out. Gone, quitting, shot. That was 20 years ago. What were people expecting? You can say the name Tyson, and that resonates with people. That means something to people, whether you're a boxing fan or a sports fan. But I remember vividly those images, what that felt like, what that looked like 20 years ago, and now nudging on for 60. What were you expecting? That's why I said last week, I don't get it. What were you expecting? 50, 60 million Netflix people tuning in. What did you expect?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would imagine that there would be certain people that didn't know what to expect. I think we said it last week that there might be people of a certain age that remember seeing Mike Tyson in the 1980s and were drawn by some faint hope that they might get to see that again. It was ludicrous that on the big screens, as Tyson is about to make his way to the ring, they're showing replays of Mike Tyson at the age of 20 knocking out Trevor Berbick in 1986. It's incredible. I think the biggest kind of concern in all of this is that it was so big in a way. But is there any other sport that could bring out one of the old legends from the 1980s and it would, in terms of interest, surpass everything that's going on in the current scene? Now, we know we get the seniors tour in tennis where you get to see John McEnroe sometimes play Andre Agassi, and but that's not going to overshadow the Wimbledon final, is it? You see it with some of the footballers. I quite like watching some of the old footballers when they play the games, but it's not going to be bigger than the Champions League final by any stretch. See it with the snookers. You have Jimmy White doing the seniors tour as well in the snooker. Now and again, it's nice to see these guys do it, but it's not going to overshadow the World Championships. But this Mike Tyson fight, 58-year-old man, bigger, I'm sorry to say, than anything else this year, including probably two Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk fights put together. I think also what you have to remember with Netflix, and we've been told for a while, largely since the emergence of DAZN and when DAZN came along and entered the boxing market, is that streaming is the way forward. This is the future. But with Netflix, it's almost like the modern day equivalent of a big fight being on ITV back in the day. Because surrounding the fight would be your Saturday night entertainment that the whole family is going to sit down and watch, and therefore you almost naturally end up watching the big fight. And that is the thing with Netflix. Its demographic is so varied and so huge, and its subscriber base is so huge, and it's got all varied kind of television on it. In terms, it's got your series, it's got your films, it's got your concerts. It's not just reliant on a sport-only crowd. And I think that's the difficulty that the DAZN have had. And I know that they've wanted to get Premier League rights, etc. But I think if we're going to start making the leap between, well, Netflix have had 60 million, so what can we do on DAZN? It's not realistic. But I knew it would be big, but I've got to say that 60 million figure is far in excess of what I thought it would be.
Obviously, for the news channels, Matt, Tyson, I won't call it a comeback, just Tyson being there, being part of it, that was a big story, or that was something to get their teeth into. It would resonate with, sports fans and boxing fans of a certain age as well, just as a news line, if nothing else. So, you're talking about what Tyson brought to the kind of news party. Are we maybe underestimating actually the role and the part that Jake Paul has and continues to play in this? It's an unpalatable truth, probably for sports and for boxing fans. But I wonder, are we maybe downplaying actually, is this really the Jake Paul story and Mike Tyson just played his part on it? Or do you think actually this was all about because the name Tyson was attached to it?
I think both of them. Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson. I remember I was on the train. I was on my way into London. Forget when it was, but Deck Taylor, my old colleague at Boxing News, sent me a text message, and I was still working at Boxing News at the time. And he went, have you heard? And I went, what? And he went, Jake Paul's fighting Mike Tyson in July. And I was just like, wow. And I should have dug out the old conversation that we had, and I said, that is going to be massive. Those two fighters, those two names. You have got Mike Tyson, which the every man on the street or the every person on the street will know. And then you've got Jake Paul, that the social media generation will know. And together, they created that. I suppose another concern as well is it was so poor in terms of entertainment, in terms of competitiveness, that are people then going to naturally take an interest in the real sport? I'm not convinced, and that was always the argument, wasn't it? Remember when we were talking about Floyd Mayweather against Conor McGregor, and the marketeers would say, well, this is going to get so many more eyes on boxing. But how many people that just watch that fight are now hardcore boxing fans? And I think it's the same with this.
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends on what role Taylor Serrano played as a co-feature.
Yeah.
But to be fair, Barrios against Ramos turned out to be an unexpectedly competitive and good fight as well. So it depends what supporting roles or starring cameos they played alongside it, really, in the eyes of those who were neutrals or casual passers-by. So yeah, it does. But otherwise, it was kind of exactly what I expected. Maybe slightly worse, the visuals with Tyson coming in with a right knee brace. His legs just stuttered and creaked. Whenever a punch came near him, it looked like he was going to stumble backwards. His balance was horrific. When he walked back to his corner in between every round, I thought they were going to come out and help him back. I mean, it was so bad to see. It was so uncomfortable and sad to see. And we shouldn't feel sorry for a guy who reportedly is getting 20 million and, felt for him. In his words, he said it was an experience that no man has the right to wish for, I think, was what he said afterwards when he talked of nearly dying in June, where he lost 2 stone in weight and had endured 8 blood transfusions as well. That's a story that sort of appeared. But actually what we saw on the night was kind of what I expected, and it's why I'm so disappointed and surprised that so many people were getting into it and have got into it in the build-up, because I don't know, I just don't understand what they were expecting to see. Of course I understand the resonance of the name Tyson and what it is that he once did, but that was 25, 30 years ago when he was doing that stuff. I mean, come on. What were you expecting?
I'd like to think that the vast majority of people that are expecting it to be something were...
But Matt, even you had that I know a lot of it's for show and maybe some of it was pre-staged. It seemed a lot of it was ad-lib, but you had even beforehand the Jake Paul putting money and bets up against everybody. Even Katie Taylor said, jokingly or not, that she'd put her whole purse on Mike Tyson to win it, and that wasn't an uncommon sentiment from people in and around the sport who really should know better.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point that I was getting to. I would hope that the vast majority of people that thought that was going to be exciting, that thought Mike Tyson could somehow roll back the years, are not educated in the sport like we are. However, I think it was in September, I wrote something for Boxing Scene, very simply, 10 reasons why Jake Paul will beat Mike Tyson. And there was an awful lot of comments on that article. And a disturbing amount were telling me I was insane for thinking that Jake Paul would beat Mike Tyson. So, yeah, I really don't know. And I don't know how many times that we've had to say it. Or you have to say, it's just not what happens in boxing. 20 years ago, he was shot to pieces. Therefore, aging by 20 years since he was shot to pieces is not going to reverse that process. It's going to make that process worse. It's as simple as that. But in terms of Netflix, where do they go from here? How can they... They're not going... For example, we've just had a terrific fight in the light heavyweight division, Artur Beterbiev versus Dimitri Bivol. I can't imagine Netflix would have touched a fight like that with a barge pole. How are they going to sell that? Neither of them are particularly willing or great talkers to sell the story themselves, are they? That sold itself to us boxing fans in here, because we knew, we've spent years and years and years following them. We've been aware that they were brilliant as amateurs. But on Netflix, have they really got the desire to tell that story and try and educate all those people that know who Mike Tyson is? Or will they attempt to do something as ridiculous as Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul? Or does it just simply show them that live sport can generate an awful lot of attention? I'm not sure in terms of Netflix's future with boxing. No doubt it's got their interest. But I think the sad thing here is, and I don't want to be negative, is that I do think that boxing today is something of a niche sport. Therefore, the stars of today are not known to the people on the street like they used to be in the 1980s and 1990s. Therefore, it's a really difficult sell. And that is because it's very often behind a paywall, and people will not pay to watch boxing. Not as many, that nowhere near as many who watched at the weekend will now want to watch our boxing, real boxing. And I think some of the viewing figures that we've seen this year is testament to that. I mean, how many people paid to watch the first Usyk Fury fight? Just over 1 million? And I know there'd have been an awful lot that was streaming it at home on their illegal boxes or whatever. But had we have been watching Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk on a platform where millions and millions and millions could watch without having to pay, that fight would have been ginormous. But the insistence on putting a price tag on the biggest events in boxing, I believe, has harmed its appeal to the widespread public.
Yeah. But this might just have piqued the interest of Netflix. It could, Matt. It could. Let's dare to dream. It could actually be an avenue for the sport. It could potentially just be a platform for boxing. If between 1% and 5% of the viewing figures of the weekend tuned in and again for something else, then suddenly you're onto something, aren't you? And they must surely feel that there is at least some scope, if not just for boxing, then for sport entertainment one way or another. You know, if 1 to 5% of that audience of the weekend suddenly makes it very, very interesting on a regular basis. So could it be something? Could it be something? And you know, I'm not as down on Jake Paul as perhaps you might expect for someone in my position, or as other people in and around boxing and in and around sport. I'm not as down on him as a lot of other people for a number of reasons. Partly because of his commitment to the sport, but that's a commitment to the sport inside and outside of the ring. And what he's done for Amanda Serrano's career has been extraordinary. And Katie Taylor, by dint of that, has been part of the story and has been able to bask in that reflected glory. She's earned it. She's created it herself. Absolutely, she deserves it. Apparently, between them sharing a $13 million purse, reportedly, unheard of. Jake Paul has helped or simply made that happen. And through their own talents, they've been able to make their journey towards that opportunity. But he's done that. And so his commitment both inside the ring as a fighter and what he's done for other people around him, I think has been significant. And I'm up with that. Absolutely. And I'll be interested to see how much further he can take that. Where he takes his own story remains to be seen. Canelo's name was mentioned. He says Canelo knows I'm the payday. I mean, Canelo can earn at least as much, if not more money elsewhere on a regular basis. So that's not strictly true, but theoretically, there is some truth in that. I think Usyk was mentioned to some of the journalists somewhat disparagingly behind the scenes as well. And the WBA boss said he'd love to see Jake Paul against Chavez Jr. Now, there starts to get a fight that's actually not far off Paul against Tyson, isn't it, in some respects? So what do you think the future looks like for Jake Paul?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not anti Jake Paul. I've warmed to him in recent years, largely because he has taken the sport seriously. It's not like he will just dip in and out. He dedicates himself to boxing training. You can see the improvements that he's made as a consequence of that dedication. He's not ever going to be a world beater, but there is an audience for what he's doing. So a Chavez Jr., as much as it winds me up just to say it, I can see why they'd make it. I think the thing that will probably get on people's nerves, those within boxing, particularly fighters, is that Jake Paul is never going to do it the right way or how they deem it to be the right way, in that he will not go looking for to fight people in order to progress and head towards the promised land of world rankings. He will just be picking out opponents that he believes a lot of people will want to watch. And I understand why people don't like that.
Yeah. Bookmakers Paddy Power actually did a stunt at the press conference, didn't he, with Tony Bellew, where Tony Bellew went with a sort of a granddad dressed up in a boxing gown and called out Jake Paul. They actually released a video as well, which had Tony Bellew apparently going around housing estates and round gyms and stuff, auditioning kind of for that role to get a would-be next veteran octogenarian potential opponent for Jake Paul. The irony is they could have done that stunt and they could have done that video as a kind of ironic send-up of Mike Tyson, as it happens. There's the joke, really, in truth. Sad as it is, but that would have been the send-up. But anyway, that probably garnered them. That's their PR team have a lot of fun. They do some good stuff with that. And boxing fans will feel that that's Jake Paul's kind of career in a nutshell. Will you ever fight a real fighter, etc., etc.? So we'll see how all of that pans out. Will Taylor and Serrano do it a third time over 12 rounds, maybe in Ireland?
I can't imagine that Katie Taylor would do it over 12 rounds, certainly not 12 threes anyway, which is Serrano's preference.
It's been mooted.
Yeah, it's been mooted. I would be surprised then. I'd be surprised if Katie Taylor would accept that. I mean, she's an advocate of the 10-2s format. It's where she has kind of built this fantastic career over that format. So I'd be surprised to see her at this stage of her career agreeing to what would be an alien format for her, where she will have to redesign the training completely and alter her mindset in regards to going 12 threes. Third fight would make sense. I thought that second one was astonishingly violent at times. This is where you fear for their futures a little bit when the age that they're at, the long careers that they've had. And I don't mean any disrespect whatsoever. Quite the opposite, actually. I just want them to be healthy. And I'm not convinced either of them need another fight like that. But if you take that out of it, you just look at it purely as a fight and the two fights that they've had, then yeah, why wouldn't they do it a third time? They obviously bring out the excitement in each other. I'm not saying necessarily they bring out the best in each other, but in terms of a spectacle, stick those two in the ring and you're going to have an exciting fight.
Yeah, amazing putting them together for sure. And I wonder if we'll see it again. It was a tough night for Chris Billam-Smith out in Saudi against Gilberto Ramirez, Zurdo, wasn't it? Good start from Billam-Smith, really positive first round, and then Ramirez just took over, didn't he? Just took over. He was just a little too cute, little too clever, little too fast, little too technical, just a little too good, wasn't he? As we kind of feared last week.
Yeah, a little too varied. I said last week that Billam-Smith needs to start fast and get Ramirez's respect early. If he can do that, he's got half a chance. And after that first round, I thought, well, he's done it here. And then it just started to unravel. And there was a point, actually, where I wondered if Billam-Smith might be hauled out. And I think credit to Billam-Smith for battling back in those last 3 rounds when it all looked to be getting away from him. That might have been partly because Ramirez was so tired. I think I've also been very vocal about I'm not convinced that Ramirez is a genuine cruiserweight, but he showed on Saturday night that he very much is. And I think it will have been very difficult for Chris Billam-Smith. I think the last time he fought a southpaw was in his 5th professional fight. I heard someone report that he didn't fight a southpaw at all as an amateur. That's an awful lot of learning to do in one training camp, to fight a southpaw, not only a southpaw, but one as technically sound and versatile as Zerdo Ramirez is. And I think that's ultimately what we saw. We saw one fighter who was just too clever for the other one. No disgrace for Billam-Smith. And onwards. And all of a sudden, Ramirez Opataya looks like a really good fight.
Yeah, that's a cracker of a fight, isn't it? Two very, very different styles. And you fancy that there's an appetite to make that fight, Matt, to make those kinds of fights.
Yeah, well, it was kind of the pretty sizable subplot for Fight Week, wasn't it? Billam-Smith and Ramirez was that the winner will or should fight Opataya, and they do seem to be a little easier to make these days. It's really the only fight at cruiserweight at the top of the division that people will want to see. Ramirez against anyone else or Opataya versus anyone else. People are going to be grumbling that it's not the fight. So, yeah, let's hope so as well. And then you will have one man at the top of the rankings.
Not sure Chris Billam-Smith could have done much more, Matt, in truth.
No, not with... No, not at all. I thought he did as well as he possibly could have done with the tools that he's got at his disposal. I think there was perhaps a hope that his physical advantages might drain the life from Ramirez. Ramirez was much better in that regard than I thought he would be. And I think at times we just saw Ramirez as just such a kind of natural boxer. Billam-Smith has always had to work exceptionally hard. And that is one of his strengths. But ultimately, he just wasn't quite good enough, and he didn't look like he was going to be quite good enough. But again, full credit to him for coming back in those last few rounds, because then it looked, if he hadn't have done, there would have been far more lopsided scorecards. But in the end, losing by 8-4 generally was the general consensus, I think, wasn't it? No disgrace in that.
No, not at all. Not at all. Certainly not on paper. I think you had to be generous. Maybe with the last sort of 8, 10, 11, which were close rounds. Yeah, I think you had to be generous giving all of those to Billam-Smith. But given what he put into it, you can understand that they did so. But he was just a bit too classy, Zerdo Ramirez. And that ability in the pocket is a bit of a gift, isn't it, Matt? Some fighters have just got it. Chocolatito has got a bit of that where they seem there to be hit, but you just can't hit them. And even when you're throwing punches, somehow they just have this sixth sense that means they're not getting clocked in the pocket. It's something otherworldly. That really is a gift. And Zerdo has got that. He looked a bit fleshy round the waist, didn't he? I mean, he is a big lump of a guy, so you sort of feel he could and should be able to build up into being a cruiserweight. But you don't see that as being a sort of drawback for him anytime soon?
It could be a drawback in a fight against Opataya, which I think will be a harder fight for him. And he did look like he was tiring in there. And I think that you could pinpoint as him just being a bit too heavy, not being at his optimum fighting weight. But in order to compete, he has to be at that weight. In order to compete at cruiserweight, that's how much he feels like he has to weigh. So I think in a tough and grueling fight with Opataya, and we've seen Opataya against the likes of Bridis, haven't we? Where he's proven that he can go 12 hard rounds and appear as strong in the 12th as he did in the first, then that is when it might affect Ramirez. So there might still be work that needs to be done there, or ultimately it might just be something that he has to deal with. I do think he needs to just forget about moving up to heavyweight. He's talking about moving up to heavyweight, winning a belt at heavyweight as well. He's not a heavyweight.
No, but he might have some of those James Toney skills that allow him to do it. You know what I mean? Yeah,
I do, actually. Yeah, that is a good point.
We'll see. What about Chris Billam-Smith? I mean, what is he, 34 now? You lose a big one like that, you see how good some of those other operators are. But it's more just the timing, Matt, isn't it? And getting another chance when you're 34. It's the gap between then and now that maybe's quite a big one mentally.
Chris Billam-Smith is such a unique character. He has got his head screwed on. He knows how violent and potentially damaging this sport can be. He knows that the longer he fights, then the more damages potentially will be inflicted upon him. He's got a young family that he adores. He's always been aware that there was a certain shelf life for him in this sport. Ideally, he would have won this fight and then he'd have had the money spinner against Obotaya. I would imagine that he got paid pretty well for this one. Whether he has earned enough that he can walk away now, I'm not sure. The difficulty, as you kind of just outlined there, is where does he go from here? Is he going to walk back into a fight where he will earn what he's become accustomed to, or is he going to have to rebuild and not earn an awful lot while the clock is ticking? I'm not sure. I mean, he's been fantastic over the last couple of years. The level of improvement that he's shown, the dedication to his trade. Don't think many people thought he was going to win a world belt a few years ago, particularly after he'd lost that tight one to Riakporhe, but he retained that focus and that belief in himself. It's whether or not he wants to do it all over again. I think he's going to have to. I think he would have to start again and rebuild. And he could be 36 by the time he gets back to a level where he'd be challenging for a title. But strange old sport, isn't it, this one? Maybe an opportunity will present itself. Maybe he'll want to move up to bridgerweight or whatever. I doubt it. But yeah, I personally, I hope he's earned what he wanted to earn from boxing as a consequence of Saturday night's fight in Saudi Arabia, and that him and his family are now financially secure.
But there is an assumption, really, that people in his position, fighting for world titles, having 2 or 3 or 4 world title fights at a certain level, there is assumption that you made pots of money. But, you know, you could guesstimate maybe what might he made a couple of million at the weekend. The Riakporhe and the Akoli fights might have made $1 million between the two of them. I mean, your 50% tax. Do you know what I mean? There is an assumption that people have made chunks of money at that level. And the truth is, when you pay it all away, the 10% here and there, as well as the tax, I mean, it might not turn out to be the dreamboat stuff that you might have imagined. So let's hope he's got some dough one way or another, and we'll see how it pans out. Certainly, they were making millions in Holyfield's time, Tyson Holyfield's time back in the 90s, and that's what we're going to talk about next in This Week. This week we take you back to the 23rd of November 1991, a homecoming for Holyfield in Atlanta, Georgia, the first big heavyweight fight in a couple of decades since Ali returned from his hiatus in Atlanta to face Jerry Quarry. There was historical resonance all round this fight, Matt, with Holyfield due to have fought Mike Tyson just a few months previously. Tyson injured, he was out, and it was substitute opponent Bert Cooper who would come in.
Yes, he was supposed to make $30 million to fight Mike Tyson, and I think he got $6 million for this one. And as Holyfield said in an interview that was broadcast before this fight, he says, well, that $30 million wasn't in my pocket. I've just got to accept that I'm not getting that just yet. Francesco Damiani, as I said earlier on, was the initial substitute. And at that particular point in time, Damiani was recognised as one of the best heavyweights in the world, most certainly in the top 10. Bert Cooper, though, not so much. He came in, I think, with about 3 or 4 days to go, with 3 or 4. I think the contracts were signed 4 days before the fight, that Bert Cooper would step in for Damiani. And the WBC refused to sanction it because Cooper wasn't in their rankings. I think the WBA and IBF titles are on the line. WBA didn't rank him either, but they didn't care. They just stuck it on the line. And he was ranked 12th by the IBF, which I can only imagine is a consequence of a victory over Joe Hipp. Now, Joe Hipp, slightly fleshy, but half decent kind of gatekeeper level heavyweight, and Cooper had looked really good against Joe Hipp, kind of giving his career a bit of new life. And Holyfield was fighting in his local stadium, wasn't he? The Omni. The previous time he'd fought there was in 1986 when he beat Dwight Muhammad Qawi to win his first world title. And he hadn't fought there since. He hadn't been back to Atlanta since. But there's something about this story with Smokin Bert Cooper that, if you like your boxing history, it's just dripping in the stuff. He says beforehand, I never went to the Olympics. I never had the opportunity. I came out of a slaughterhouse. Those are his exact words. Bert Cooper, the 9th of 11 children. He started boxing at the age of 12 when he was taken to Joe Frazier's gym. And there began almost like this father-son bond between Joe Frazier and Bert Cooper. Frazier saw something in Bert Cooper that reminded him of himself. And for a while, if you go back and you look at certain record books of the time when Bert Cooper turned professional, he is listed as Bert Cooper Frazier. So he was known as Bert Cooper Frazier during the early days of his professional career. You could see the similarities in Joe Frazier and Bert Cooper. And as much as I love Bert Cooper, he is very much a poor man's Joe Frazier. Let's be honest about that. But his left hook, when he got it swinging, was a heck of a weapon. In this one, his right hook was pretty impressive as well. But there was this concern with Bert Cooper, particularly. I remember when this fight, I think I read about Bert Cooper coming in on teletext. And I remember at the time thinking, whoa, because Bert Cooper, he'd quit against George Foreman, he'd quit against Carl Williams, I think Reggie Gross as well. He turned his back on Reggie Gross earlier on in his career. But it was when he lost to Carl Williams that he claimed, and this is when he was quite a promising heavyweight, he claimed that a shot had left him deaf in one ear. Joe Frazier did not like that quit at all, but behind the scenes, Cooper is kind of lost in this substance addiction, and Frazier was aware of that as well and just didn't want any part of him. And that was when that relationship came to an end. But at this fight, it looked like he was in good shape, even though it was only a few days' notice. But that was the concern, that, hang on, this is Bert Cooper. There's no chance whatsoever. Even when he knew he had a fight, he couldn't keep himself on the straight and narrow. So if he didn't know he was having a fight, what on earth are we going to get? And all of that is why Bert Cooper was a ginormous underdog. But for a few rounds, he made his presence felt and then some. But you did think in that opening round, as he went down to a wicked left to the body from Holyfield, that was all she wrote. And the easy victory for Holyfield that the vast majority of people were predicting was just unfolding before our eyes in those first 3 minutes. But he got back up and he made a bit of a fight of it, didn't he? And he was threatening in round 2. And then we had that moment, the Smokin Bert Cooper moment in round 3, didn't we? Where the right hand goes in as Holyfield is a little bit over-exuberant, a little bit careless, probably too determined to put on a show in front of his home fans. And he gets caught by that right hand, and his equilibrium is briefly shot, kind of spins round a little bit, doesn't he, after taking another shot. And he has to grab onto the ropes to stop himself from hitting the canvas. Mills Lane does exactly the right thing by administering a count. And that is the first count that Evander Holyfield would take as a professional fighter.
And there'll be echoes of that in Holyfield Bull 1, won't there, where he gets hurt by a shot he leans on the ropes and he almost spins round. Very similar to Holyfield won in their first fight, which would be a few years later. But yeah, that third round. And then we get what becomes customary throughout Holyfield's career. We get Holyfield hurt and then this unbelievable rally. In that third round, Holyfield hurt. Looks like he might be in real serious trouble. There's still 2 minutes on the clock. Cooper's going after him, and then Holyfield rallies. In the final minute, you've got Holyfield coming back. Is Holyfield Bow still to come in the post? It's the ghosts of Christmas future, isn't it? In this one, typical Holyfield. What would become typical Holyfield?
We talk about some of the great rounds in heavyweight history, and we spoke about one a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? Or was it even last week? Riddick Bowe against Evander Holyfield, that famous 10th round. I actually think round 3 here is a better round in terms of action and excitement and drama, because you've got Bert Cooper, who I think was a 22-1 underdog, rightly so as well, 22-1 underdog, and he has just been responsible for the first count being administered over Evander Holyfield, and then he looks in trouble, and then Holyfield turns it around, and Cooper is kind of all over the place. But yeah, I think as a round, I don't think the fight is worthy of being regarded as one of the greatest in history, but that round for sheer drama, I think it's right up there.
And then there's a bit later on, isn't there? Because in the 5th round, Holyfield lands a couple of big shots himself. There's a right hand and a left hook going early, and Bert Cooper's hurt, and he just half turns away, Matt, doesn't he? As if he's had enough, or as if the pain was just simply too much, and then he checks himself and he kind of re-engages. And Holyfield looks like he's blown a gasket. He looks like he's thrown too many punches and he's gassed. And then there's a tear in the glove, and there's a break for a couple of minutes in that 5th round. And I think it really serves Holyfield well, because the glimmer of hope for Bert Cooper just seems to have been ignited, and it's Holyfield who builds on that. There's one right hand from Cooper in the 6th, but there's a lot less commentary pick up on it. And then in the 7th, it is pretty much all Holyfield. You know, I counted the number of uppercuts Holyfield throws in that 7th round. Guess how many? It's unbelievable.
No idea.
16.
Wow. I bet most of them land as well, don't they?
It was certainly the last 22 seconds is just non-stop punching, isn't it? The last 22 seconds of the fight. But yeah, 17 uppercuts. I think 16, 17 uppercuts in that round. But then just a salvo of punches in the final 20-odd seconds.
Yeah, and there was some suggestion at the time. I know that Cooper's corner are saying, why have they just stopped the fight there? Yet in round 3 they stopped the fight to give Holyfield a breather. It's two different scenarios. I think it's much later in the fight as well. I don't think Mills Lane was at fault, but it was a storyline of the fight afterwards that Cooper had just been stopped, whereas they'd given a standing count to Holyfield. But the ropes were not keeping Bert Cooper up. His heart and resilience is the reason that he was still standing. But the amount of unanswered punches, the way that the fight was developing, I think it was the right decision. From Bert Cooper's point of view, I can understand why he was a bit miffed. But yeah, he'd said beforehand, you will never see me quit in a boxing ring again, because it was kind of following him round, this reputation he had of being a quitter. And they did reference some of the old fights, but as Larry Merchant said, didn't he? And in co-coms, he said something along the lines of, "Look, okay, we can't. This can't be the stick that we keep beating him with. We have to remember that back in the day, in the late '80s, he had a drug problem. He's not that guy anymore." And a motivated Bert Cooper. Again, as much as I love him, I'm not going to say he was one of the best heavyweight. He certainly wasn't a top 5 heavyweight, but when he was motivated, he was such a different beast to kind of he was almost journeyman level when he wasn't motivated. But when he was, yeah, he was a really difficult fighter to beat.
Handful, as we saw against Holyfield and against Michael Moorer. Just little glimpses, avenues. Maybe it seemed like he was a punch from the promised land, but not quite for Smokin Bert, who made it difficult for Holyfield on this night, as he had done. Would do against Michael Moorer, 3.5 years later, I think he'd bump into Moorer, who was on this undercard. First round stoppage for Moorer, moved to 26-0. And Lennox Lewis, another future champion, was on this undercard as well. Lennox moved to 18-0. He beat Briggs in 3 rounds. Biggs, I should say, in 3 rounds. That was on the back. I mean, he'd been fighting British and European level, hadn't he? He'd beaten Glenn McCrory and Derek Sweet D. Williams in fights prior to this night in 91. Lennox on the undercard alongside Michael Moorer. Another couple of layers to the heavyweight story, Matt, on this night.
Yeah, there was talk, wasn't there, right at the start? Well, I don't know if it was right at the start of the broadcast, but the one that the recording that I see, they kind of come in and they're talking about Lennox Lewis, and they said, does that performance against Tyrell Biggs justify his position as one of the leading heavyweights? Was Biggs a good enough opponent? And George Foreman's something, because he's not in the studio, is he? Because he's preparing for his own fight. George Foreman says something along the lines of, yeah, he looks great. I have no desire to fight him. Never want to fight Lennox Lewis in my life. Thank you very much. And it's so refreshing at times, that kind of honesty. And but yeah, it was the dawn really of this 1990s era that at the time, when Tyson was injured, Holyfield is struggling against Bert Cooper. He's been taking the distance by George Foreman. People are going, this heavyweight era's just taken an absolute nosedive from the previous one, which was exhilarating, unbeatable Mike Tyson. And now we're having to deal with the hangover of that. But really, these were the building blocks that were all being put in place around this time that would see one of the greatest eras develop in the heavyweight landscape.
Very much so. Very much so. Tens of millions of dollars up for grabs for people like Holyfield, for people like Tyson. Let's hope CBS has put enough away with his efforts over the weekend to get himself some retirement money, or maybe the platform to push on for one last go. And by the way, if you want a really good doc to watch for all of the kind of stories surrounding Holyfield and Tyson, there's a really good ESPN doc that I mentioned before on the pod called Chasing Tyson. So part of the ESPN 30 for 30 series. You can get hold of that, Chasing Tyson 30 for 30 ESPN series. And it goes through all of the timelines, the times it was nearly on, should have happened, didn't happen, their careers going side by side, kind of in tandem but separate, and then finally coming together. That's a brilliant doc, Chasing Tyson. Really well worth a watch if you haven't seen it.
It's incredible, really, and it is kind of related, is that the level of disrespect for Evander Holyfield after this fight, particularly in kind of the written boxing press, was, looking back on it now, really offensive, in that you've struggled with these old has-beens. You've just been dropped by Bert Cooper. What business have you got being the world heavyweight champion? Mike Tyson will destroy you. And the reality of the situation is that Holyfield came through one of the toughest moments of his career. And okay, he didn't look great doing it, but as you know, even you would think that people would have had the intelligence to know that just because he fought like that against Bert Cooper, he's not going to fight like that against Mike Tyson. And even at the time when I was reading, I was like, well, he's not going to fight like that against Mike Tyson, is he? But there was just so much disrespect for Evander Holyfield at the time. It was incredible that it did go away to an extent when he fought Riddick Bowe, and he was kind of heroic in defeat. It went away to an extent when he beat Riddick Bowe in the rematch, but it wasn't until he fought Mike Tyson that people gave Evander Holyfield the respect that his his performances and his desire deserved.
Shows you, doesn't it? We tend to think of that overly critical analysis and underappreciation perhaps of fighters as a modern phenomenon, but 30 years ago, that dogma that was around even back then. Yes, Holyfield would prove the disbelievers and the critics wrong, of course, in part courtesy of his first fight with Riddick Bowe, which would come a year or so later. He was closing in on that big fight. That's Holyfield against Cooper from 1991, our This Week in History. And we'll be back again later on this week for those who are signed up to Apple Plus. More of you have been tuning in via that, getting the bonus pods, and of course via the Patreon app or patreon.com as well, where for less than $5 a month you get bonus pods each and every week, and indeed of course ad-free content on the pod as well. If you want to get that or just support us, then you can go to patreon.com, get the Patreon app, or sign up with Apple Plus easily if they're your provider as well. And for all of you who are doing that, we'll speak to you later in the week. Bye for now.